Hello, my name is Eric Gunnarsson, and this is a talk on energy systems, fueling, and exercise. When I'm trying to learn how a specific system works, I sometimes choose to write a presentation to make sure that I really understand it to the depth that I want to understand it. And that's what I've done here. So you're kind of seeing the result of some of the research I've done. Research for me, not high-level research. I'm calling this a just enough biochemistry talk. I've included quite a bit of biochemistry, but I've tried to keep it at a level that is manageable because biochemistry is endlessly complex and you can keep going and going too deep. So to start, I got interested in this area because of a bunch of different questions. So why are there different kinds of training? Why do we train in different ways rather than just always just going out, for me, riding our bikes? What kind of diet should I eat? If I want to lose weight, how do I lose weight? Conversely, why are some people really thin when they do exercise? Why are some people not thin at all? How do I feel during exercise? And a really interesting thing I've seen, how can one of the people I ride with ride like 3 hours without eating at all and just seem strong the whole time? Where if I did that, I'd be bonking. I'd run out of energy and just be lying at the side of the road. So those are the kind of questions I was trying to answer when I first got into this. Now we're going to start at the very lowest level. And when we get to this, don't worry if the details are too complex. If you can just get kind of the main gist, you'll be fine later on. So we're going to start with a single molecule, and this is a molecule called adenosine triphosphate. So on the left side, we have the adenosine, and on the right side, we have 3 phosphate groups. So 3 equals triphosphate. Now, since that's a long name, and we're going to use it a lot, we're going to use an acronym called ATP for this. And you've probably heard of ATP before. Now, the thing that we really care about adenosine triphosphate is this high energy bond between the outer phosphate group and the phosphate group that's right next to that. And what I mean when I say high energy bond is to hook those 2 phosphates together required putting some energy into the system. So it's kind of how the chemistry works. So our whole goal is to utilize the energy contained in that specific bond to do some work. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to ship the ATP over to the muscles. And in fact, the ATP actually attaches into the muscle. And then we're going to break off the phosphate group, send the energy over into the muscle, and the muscle is going to use that to contract. That's how the fibers actually physically move. So now that we've completed that, we have kind of our leftovers. So what leftovers do we have? Well, we still have the adenosine. Now we only have 2 phosphates. So instead of triphosphate, it's diphosphate. And we therefore call this ADP instead of ATP. So the only difference between these is we've pulled that 1 phosphate off and used the energy for the muscles. Now, obviously, at this point, the ADP isn't useful because we need ATP. So we need to send it into a process to regenerate the ATP. And we'll talk more about the different ways we regenerate coming up, but you can think of it just as the abstract. We need a way to get energy back into the system, and regeneration provides that. So we get some energy, we use that to hook the phosphate back on, and then we're back to ATP again. So it's a constant cycle that's always running. Anything we do with our muscles is using this cycle. Now you will, at times, even in this talk, hear about creating ATP. And whenever you hear someone say creating ATP, what they're really talking about is taking ADP and converting it to ATP. And just so we can use it later. So just remember that ATP goes to ADP, and then we have to put some energy back in to get back to ATP. So this is the low level part. Now the question is, where does the energy for where does the energy for regeneration come from? And there are different ways to get the energy. The first one is what is called the phosphocreatine pool. Sometimes you'll hear about this as the creatine phosphate system. Basically, we have these molecules known as creatine phosphate. And you notice they look a little bit like ATP. We have creatine and then we have a phosphate group hanging off the side. And just like the ATP example, there is energy in the bond between those two groups. And in fact, it's more energy than we need to put the phosphate onto ATP. So what we can do is creatine phosphate, send it over, break the bond apart, and use the energy to hook the phosphate back on. And we've therefore kind of traded the bond energy in the creatine phosphate for the bond energy in ATP. So we've done that, and of course we can do that with all of the creatine phosphate molecules in the pool. By pool, I just mean they're accumulated in the cell. The problem is the size of the pool is limited, and it's limited to about 10 or 15 seconds of energy. Now, the big advantage here is because the creatine phosphate molecules are right there and the interactions are quick, we can get a lot of energy out of this. So this is used for things like sprinting. Anything that has very high energy output is using the creatine phosphate system. The problem is, of course, as I said, it's limited in size. After 15 seconds, we run out of energy. So we're in this state, and obviously, kind of like we needed to regenerate ATP, we need to regenerate the creatine phosphate. At this point, we're going to use ATP as an energy source coming in, use that to hook the creatine and the phosphate back together, and it goes back into our pool. So that will took about 10 or 15 seconds to pull all the energy out. It's going to take somewhere on the order of 3 to 5 minutes to fully recover back to the state we were before. If you do sports or exercises that require really high energy output, you're using this energy system, and that's one of the reasons why you use it for a while, and then guess what? You have to wait to recover. Now, the creatine phosphate system isn't really an energy source. It's more a way to hold on to some energy so that we can use it quickly. So we need some energy sources for us to essentially provide the energy into the system, and it comes from the food that we eat. So now I'm going to talk about those. Switching over to that, within our muscles, within the muscle cells, there are small structures known as mitochondria. And mitochondria are usually talked about as kind of the energy powerhouses of the cells. So let's start by talking about fatty acids. And fatty acids are like these small components of the fat that we eat. So we have fat, it comes in as triglycerides. The tri means 3, and there are 3 fatty acids in a triglyceride. So when we want to convert this to energy, we're going to feed it into a process known as beta oxidation. And what happens is we chop up the fatty acid. Fatty acids are long chains, and we chop part off the chain, we add in some oxygen, and from that we get 4 ATP out. Now, as I said before, we're not actually getting ATP molecules, we're taking 4 ADP molecules and converting them back to ATP. So we've done that, we've gotten some energy, and we also get another compound or another chemical out. This molecule is called acetyl-CoA. And the acetyl-CoA feeds into another set called the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. And Along with some oxygen, acetyl-CoA will yield a further 10 ATP. So this is the way fatty acids get burned. The beta oxidation, we get some ATP, acetyl-CoA, we get some more ATP, and then finally we're done. So we've talked about fat. Next, I'd like to talk about amino acids. So amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. And proteins can both be used as structure within the body, and they can also be burned. Now, I'm just going to show them as feeding directly into the citric acid cycle. This is a significant oversimplification. Each amino acid is different in structure, and how it gets converted into something that can feed into the citric acid cycle is pretty complicated. But the main point here is that we can take amino acids, feed them into the citric acid cycle, and get energy out of them. It's not a significant amount for exercise, maybe 10 or 15%, but it's not nothing. So it's just something to know. We can also burn protein. So I've shown you the pathway for burning fatty acids. I've kind of talked a little bit about the pathway for burning protein. And obviously, the next part is going to be about carbohydrates. And this is where the story gets kind of interesting. Because when we start with carbohydrates, we're not going to start in the mitochondria. We're going to start out in the cytoplasm, which is just the rest of the cell. So you have the cell, and kind of the gel inside is the cytoplasm. And the carbohydrates for us to burn need to be in the form of glucose. So we take the glucose, that feeds into a process known as glycolysis, and that produces some ATP, and it also produces a compound known as pyruvate. So at this point, we've kind of gone the first step for glucose, but we have a problem. And the problem is if the pyruvate just accumulates in the cytoplasm, it will poison the reaction. We won't be able to do glycolysis anymore. So we need something to do with the pyruvate. And also the pyruvate still has energy in it that we would like to capture. So what we do with the pyruvate is we send it over into the mitochondria, and it goes through pyruvate oxidation with the addition of some oxygen, and then gives us acetyl-CoA, and that feeds into the cycle. So the important point here is really two things. First of all, the way that fatty acids are oxidized or burned is separate than the way glucose is burned. Really two parallel systems. The second point is that part of the system for glucose happens in the cytoplasm, and part of it happens in the mitochondria. And if you look at the diagram for the cytoplasm, you'll notice that there's no oxygen coming in. So glycolysis does not require oxygen. So as I said, one of the problems we're having with glycolysis is we're accumulating this pyruvate. What can we do to get rid of the pyruvate? Well, we can go through a process called lactate reduction and create lactate, which you've probably heard of. And the lactate can pile up in the cell, and that means we can do more glycolysis and generate more energy. So now we're accumulating lactate. And, well, obviously we can't accumulate lactate forever, so what happens to the lactate? Well, like the pyruvate, it gets fed over to the mitochondria, and then we need oxygen to convert it back to pyruvate, and then we need more oxygen to convert the pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. So at this point, I hope you're kind of scratching your head saying, why would we ever want to do this? Because if we can just take the pyruvate across to the pyruvate oxidation, why would we want to go to lactate? I mean, maybe we can build up a little lactate, but eventually we have to send it across, and that's obviously only a temporary measure. So why would we want to do that? And the reason we want to do it is really kind of an interesting outcome. To get rid of the lactate, we do need to oxidize it, but we can release it to the bloodstream, and we can oxidize it elsewhere in the body. So we have, say we're cycling and our leg muscles are producing a lot of lactate, but our arm muscles, our heart, our liver, and our kidneys can take that lactate in and do the lactate oxidation part, the rest of the cycle, and use it to generate their energy. So basically, we have this neat little trick where we can run glycolysis in a muscle faster than we're actually able to support it in the mitochondria. And then we'll send the lactate somewhere else and let the rest of the body clean up. So this is really important to understand the differences between how fatty acids are burned and how glucose is burned. So you can think of fatty acids, everything has to be in the presence of oxygen, everything has to be in the mitochondria. For glucose, you can do this first step, the first step of glycolysis, without any oxygen, and then send your lactate somewhere else. So let's talk about how this relates to exercise intensity. And here we have a chart that shows across the bottom, it shows the power in watts. So this is an athlete on an exercise bike. And then on the left, we see what we're measuring on the vertical axis is the amount of lactate in the blood. So the way they do this is put you on the exercise bike, have you ride at a specific intensity, and then they'll actually sample your blood, measure the lactate. And you notice we have 5 points on the chart, and then we have a curve fit to it. So we sampled at 150 watts, 200 watts, 250, 300, and then finally 350 watts. So that's how we've generated this data. So what does this mean, knowing what we know about the energy systems from the last slide? Well, I'm going to draw a line here. It's kind of an arbitrary line, but to the left of this line, you can see that the lactate levels in the blood are low. And what does that mean? Well, it means we're mostly doing everything within the muscle cells. We're doing glycolysis, but the pyruvate we're getting is feeding into the mitochondria in those muscle cells. So we're primarily training in a way I would call the non-lactate way. We're not generating much lactate, maybe some, but not much. And you can argue whether I should draw the line at 200 or 175 or even at 150 for this particular athlete. But it's not terribly important where I do the line. This is what I would call the base training range, where we're trying to improve our aerobic capacity. And by aerobic capacity, so aerobic means with oxygen. So we're trying to improve the capacity of our mitochondria to do their operations, either burning the fatty acids or burning the pyruvate that came from the glycolysis. So this is why base training is low level. It's because that's the only part that is generating, is occupying itself when you're doing low level training. And in cycling, for a long time, there's been a concept of doing base training. Sometimes it's expressed as what's called LSD training, long, steady distance. So you're riding a long period of time at a steady and actually fairly low intensity, and you're doing it for a long distance. So long, steady distance. And knowing what we know about the energy systems, that makes sense. It's like we want to be training down there. So that's kind of the base training. Now I'm going to draw another line on the chart. I'm going to draw a line up here. And what does this line mean? Well, what you'll notice is the curve is coming across, and then when we reach this point, it's not really curvy anymore. It's just pretty much straight. And what does that tell us? Well, we know that as we increased our intensity, we are going to do more with glycolysis to give us more energy, and we're going to start shipping lactate out of our muscles to other cells. And as we start doing that, the more lactate we generate, the more lactate we have in the blood. And the other tissues at some point kind of reach their capacity of being able to deal with the lactate. And at that point, that's when we get a straight line. If we work harder, all we're doing is is putting more lactate into the blood because the tissues can't pull any more out, essentially. That point is what's called the lactate threshold. So it's kind of the point where we've just reached the limit of what we can deal. So I'm going to label this whole chunk, once we get above that line where we start generating significant lactate, I'm going to call that the lactate part of the intensity spectrum. And we'll draw in some colors here. And now to talk about training related to this. Now, if we wanted to train to be better at lactate, dealing with lactate, what we'd want to do is be around the lactic threshold. I'm going to call that lactate clearance training. Our whole goal is to get the rest of our body better at taking in lactate and burning it. Now, to do that, I might do efforts right at my lactic threshold, as well as I can measure it, or I might do short intervals where I do 2 minutes below, 2 minutes above, 2 minutes below, 2 minutes above. There are a lot of different options for those sort of training. But that's the goal of that specific training. And then at the high end, we have what we would be doing like high output intervals. So high output intervals are both going to push us to get better at lactic clearance. And they're also, because we're beyond the point where we can generate energy with glycolysis, they're going to push us to improve our creatine phosphate system. So think of intervals, the really hard intervals at the top, they kind of give us dual benefit. We also do efforts to try to improve our lactic threshold. But we have this interesting space between the base training and the lactate clearance training. We have this intensity range. And I call that intensity range kind of hard. And I came up with that, just you go around and you talk with people, and you go out on a group ride and they'll say, how hard are you going? Oh, I was going kind of hard. It wasn't easy, because if it was easy, I'd be down in base training, and it wasn't hard enough that I was at lactic threshold where I was really working hard, just kind of in the middle. And what do we know about what intensities here do to our energy systems? So, well, we know that we've already maxed out our base training because we're using as much energy as we can from the aerobic side. So it doesn't really work that great as a base training thing. And partly because we can't ride long enough at this higher output. Remember, I wanted long, steady distance for base training. And part of it is that once we start getting a lot of lactate, our aerobic part actually slows down a little bit. So we don't really get the kind of base training that we want. And we're not high enough to get the lactic threshold effect, the training around there that we want. We're just kind of in between. So this sort of training, say at 250 watts, is kind of hard, but we don't get a ton of benefit from it. And more important, we get tired from it. And if you've ever tried to do the high output intervals or the lactic clearance training, you know that that's hard work and it's hard not to do. It's hard to do if you're not well rested. If you spend a lot of time in a kind of hard intensity, you won't be well rested. So this is why most training programs, you spend time doing base training and you spend focused time doing these high intervals, and you don't spend much time in between. Now, there are reasons that you'd want to do training in between. That might actually be your race pace for whatever race distance you're doing, and there are other reasons for doing it. But generally, we want to do training either at one intensity end or the other intensity end. So there's an interesting question here. I'm going to pose this to you based on what you know. What kind of fuel do we burn in each zone? And so let's start with the lactate zone. So going from 200 watts up above, what fuel is providing that energy, the energy above 200 watts? And as we saw in the big diagram, that energy can only come from glycolysis. We've already maxed out our ability to do aerobic energy generation. So it can only come from glycolysis. And since it can only come from glycolysis, The lactate zone there is always coming from glucose. Now we have the 200 watts that we have to get there is still coming from the non-lactate zone, but anything additional beyond that has to come from glucose. So the question is, where are we getting the energy for the non-lactate zone, for what I call the base zone? And this is a really interesting question. So the question is, are we burning glucose there, or are we using fatty acids? And if you go out and you research this, or if you've taken a physiology class, you've probably seen a graph like this. And here's 5 examples I pulled up pretty quickly, and they all pretty much show the same thing. What they show is that at low intensities, you burn mostly fat or mostly fat and very little carbohydrate. CHO is carbohydrate or glucose. And at high intensities, you burn very little fat and mostly carbohydrate. And you notice they choose different amounts. You know, some say 10%, some say 0%. But this is a really common concept, and I would say this is conventional wisdom as far as fat burning and carbohydrate burning. Is it correct? Well, I'll talk about that in a minute. So keep these in mind. So to explore this further, I want to flip back to the model that we had inside the mitochondria. And I've simplified things just to make the chart easier. So remember, we can either do one of 2 things. We can either take fatty acids, beta oxidize them to acetyl-CoA, or we can take pyruvate, send it through pyruvate oxidation, and that also gives us acetyl-CoA. So we have those 2 parallel systems. So there are 2 options, since we have two parallel paths. We could have what I'll call a glucose-dominated path. And that means our mitochondria are very good at oxidizing pyruvate. They can do a lot of pyruvate oxidation, but they can't do much beta oxidation. Or conversely, we could be fatty acid dominated. Maybe we're not very good at pyruvate oxidation, but we're really good at beta oxidation. My point here is that because these are 2 parallel systems, there are training effects, independent training effects for each of them. So we can train ourselves to be glucose dominated, or we can train ourselves to be fatty acid dominated. And what controls this? Well, it's really pretty simple. It's controlled by the abundance of glucose when you're training. So on the glucose dominated side, what would send you there? If you have a high carb based diet, the traditional lots of carbs athlete diet, and you have carbs before, during, or after exercise. Before and during are more important than the after. Both of those means that whenever you're training, there's lots of glucose there, and because you have lots of glucose, you are going to train up the pyruvate oxidation side. This is especially true if you have enough glucose in your system that your blood glucose is actually elevated. If you're in that state when you're training, or when you start training, your beta oxidation is pretty much shut off until your blood glucose goes back down. So that's what drives you to be glucose dominated. Not surprisingly, how do we get to the opposite side? Well, if glucose is rare or limited, we'll end up being fatty acid dominated. What gets us there? Well, a lower carb diet, one that doesn't have quite as many available carbs, few carbs before, during, or after the exercise, and finally, the biggest driver, fasted training. So if we get up on our bike, get up in the morning, skip breakfast, get on our bikes, ride for 2 or 3 hours, that sort of fasted training, we're not going to have much glucose, and that's going to push our system to get better at beta oxidation. So how you train controls what you burn. If you're training where glucose is abundant, you'll be good at burning glucose. If you're training where glucose is limited, you'll be good at burning fatty acids. Now, an important point is that if you remember when you first started exercising, it took you a while to get up to the point where you could exercise hard, where you were well trained. So if you spent a lot of time becoming well trained in the glucose dominated sense, can you just flip right over and become good at the fatty acid dominated sense? Well, the answer is no. This is a training effect, and the training effect takes time. Weeks to small numbers of months to get pretty good at it. So just remember the point. We can push to the fatty acid dominated or push to the glucose dominated based on the choices we make on how we train and how we eat. Okay? So I said earlier that I didn't really like those charts that I found in the physiology books. So let's talk about them. And we're going to look, rather than looking at a chart from a physiology book, we're going to look at some data from some athletes. And here's the first chart. And this is pretty much like that intensity chart we saw before. So left is low intensity, right is high intensity. And on the left side, we're showing the percentage of energy that comes from from glucose, CHO, and from fat. So this is our first athlete. And we brought the athlete, they joined a study, we brought them into the lab. They fasted, and then they came in and generated this data. So given that they're fasted, this is probably the best fat burning this athlete can produce. So what do we notice? Well, that's one of the charts that I pulled up. And I would argue that this chart really doesn't resemble very much the one that I pulled from the book. They really look quite a bit different. What we notice is that the fat oxidation percentage for this athlete is never above 30%. It's not really even above 25%. At all intensities, they burn very little fat and they burn a lot of carbohydrate. Now we do notice how the carbohydrate goes up and the fat goes down as we get to 2.5 and above, and that's what we would expect. So, and remember this is percentages. So we hit 2.5 and we're now into a point where we're generating lactate, and to go above that, the only way we can increase our power is by generating the lactate, and we can only do that through glycolysis, and we can only do that through glucose. So once we reach that point, the carbohydrates have to go up. It's just part of the system. We can't generate the high powers just in the mitochondria. We need to do the lactate, kind of that lactate shuffle. So looking at this athlete and knowing what we know about the energy systems, what's your guess about what this athlete's diet is like? Do they eat low carb? Do they eat moderate carb? Or do they eat high carb? So I hope you look at this and you say, wow, this guy eats a lot of carbs. And in fact, not only does this guy eat a lot of carbs, he confessed that he really has a sweet tooth. So not only does he eat a lot of carbs, he eats a lot of sugar and candy, and he's kind of snacking a lot of time. So what does that mean? Lots of glucose when he's training. And what would we expect? We'd expect that he's glucose dominated in my terms. And that's what this shows. And I used to be like this. I used to not only eat a fairly high carb, I didn't snack that much, but I'd eat a fairly high carb diet, and I always had carbs before, during, and after. So the point of the study was not to just measure this, but to look at how athletes responded to diet. So what the study did is they took this diet and they took this athlete and they put him on a keto diet. So keto diet's very small amounts of glucose, on the order of 30 grams a day. And said, go away for 10 weeks and come back and we'll test you again. And what do you think happened to this athlete when they went on a keto diet? They essentially got rid of all the carbs. Well, you can kind of figure that out. If you hold up your hand and cover the blue part, the carbohydrate trace on there, you can see what their power producing ability was. All they have left, As we've taken the glucose away from them, all they have left is the fat. And they don't burn fat very well. So what does it mean? Well, it means they really can't do anything on the bike. And so this athlete decides that the keto diet is just way too hard. He's way too hard. So he doesn't stick with the keto diet, but he does reduce the amount of carbs that he eats. Kind of gets rid of the snacks and the candy, and he reduces the complex carbs like potatoes, pasta, those sort of things somewhat. So he goes away and trains for 10 weeks. So we bring him back in, put him on the exercise bike, and what do we see? Well, here's the results we get. So the before values are dotted, and the after ones are solid lines. So what do we see? Well, we see that actually his fat oxidation went up quite a bit. So he was getting maybe 25% in the low intensities from fat before. Now he can get all the way up to maybe 45%. Okay. So that's almost double in 10 weeks. So that's pretty significant change. And we notice that also his carbohydrate went down too. Okay, so both of those are good things. One of the other things we notice is if we look at the top end, we'll see that before he went all the way up to 3.5, and now he's like 3.3. So I kind of lost some of his power. And it's not clear. I don't actually have the details, so it's not clear what happened here. It could be that he actually lost power. It could be that he's really not adapted to the diet yet. It could be he's playing around with the diet and it's kind of throwing him off. But in this case, he did end up with a little less power, but he ended up with much better fat utilization. So talk about why you might want that soon. Okay, so that's the first athlete. Let's look at the second athlete. So what do you think the diet is like for this athlete, looking at these curves? So is it low carb? Is it moderate carb? Is it high carb? So this athlete started out in moderate carb. And as you can see, they're starting out with pretty good fat utilization, or at least much better than athlete number one. They're 40, maybe 45%. And we notice, just like the first athlete, the tailing off at about 2.7, the fat percentage goes down and the carbohydrate percentage goes up, and that's obvious. We're just in the lactate realm, deep in the lactate realm, and all that extra energy is only coming from carbohydrate. So it's pretty much what we'd expect. And as I said, this athlete eats kind of a quality athlete diet, moderate carb, not really high carb, not a lot of sugary snacks. So we take this athlete and give him the same instructions, go off and do this keto diet for 10 weeks, and then come back and we'll test you again. And this athlete tries and kind of has a similar effect. And by similar effect, I mean that he's also kind of unhappy with the diet. And this is really a pretty good indication of why I wouldn't really recommend keto diets for most athletes, at least if you're interested in performance. Because remember, looking at the upper end of this chart, above 2.7, we're getting that extra power from glucose. That glucose has to come from somewhere. And if you're doing this for a significant amount of time, you're not going to get enough in your diet, and your body can't create enough on its own. So you're going to lose kind of that high aerobic power. So he didn't quite stick with keto, but he made a good job. He didn't eat a lot of complex carbs, and he didn't eat a lot of fruit. So he's eating what I call a low carb diet. Not quite keto, but kind of keto close, or keto adjacent. So he does that for 10 weeks. He trains hard, comes back. And here's the data we get. And this is really a significant change. So once again, dotted lines are the old data, solid lines are the new data. So if we look, we now see that he burns like more than 60% of his energy comes from fat until almost all the way at the top. So this has been a big training effect. He's much, much better at beta oxidation than he was before. And you notice there is kind of a crossover at the end, but barely a crossover. And of course, I need to point out that neither of these charts for this athlete looked like the charts you see in the physiology book either. So the reality is that the physiology book charts just aren't very accurate. So this athlete, by going to quite a low-carb diet, managed to push his fat oxidation percentage way up. Now, why might he want to do this? Why would he care? Well, there are a few reasons. The first is, if he wants to improve his body composition, if he wants to reduce the amount of fat he carries, this sort of profile is much more effective. So you compare this athlete after to athlete number 1 before. You send them both out on a ride. It's a couple-hour ride. They burn 1,000 calories, let's say. The athlete 1 before, very carb-dominated, very glucose-dominated, might only burn 200 calories from fat. This athlete is going to burn somewhere around 700, maybe 750 calories from fat. So generally speaking, as a guideline, if you are burning fat during exercise, the fat you burn is not a big driver of hunger. The carbs you burn are a significant driver of hunger. So if you want to burn fat, you want to be an athlete who is better at fat oxidation. So this athlete has accomplished that. The other reason you might want this is if you think of a longer ride, think of how much this athlete has to eat to participate in, I don't know, a 4 or 5 or 6 or even 7-hour effort. Before, they were still burning quite a bit of carbohydrate, so they either have to get that carbohydrate from their glycogen stores, or they have to get that carbohydrate from what they eat. And that can be challenging on long rides to eat enough carbohydrate to support the amount that you're burning. But you look at the after chart for this athlete, and at most of these intensities, this athlete just isn't burning that much carbohydrate. So they can either get by, if it's a short ride, they can get by probably without eating anything. And if it's a longer ride, they don't have to eat that much, especially compared to what they would have been like before. So those are the big benefits that you might see from getting this. So that kind of is the end of the talk. I want to talk through kind of a quick summary and some of the implications that I think come out of the way the energy systems work. The first is that different training intensities drive different energy systems. So we saw that on the chart. Low intensity to build aerobic base capacity, near the lactic threshold to build lactate clearance capacity, and high power to stress and improve the creatine phosphate system. And that also helps with lactate clearance. Conversely, not spending a lot of time in between the low intensity and the lactate threshold, at least from a training perspective. The second implication, the amount of fat and glucose you burn in the aerobic zone, base zone, mitochondrial zone, is controlled by the amount of glucose content in your base diet and the glucose availability before, during, and after training. So if glucose is always available, if you use hydration drinks that have a lot of glucose in, like I used to, you will be very good at burning glucose and you'll be poor at burning fat. Conversely, if you have less glucose in your base diet and you have less glucose available from what you eat before, during, and after, then you will get better at beta oxidation. It's an obvious caveat here that when you first start out, if you're trying to get better at the fat oxidation side and you limit your glucose, you run the risk of running out of glucose or bonking, and that's no fun. So the important things are, A, to limit the amount of glucose you're burning when you're trying to improve this. What does that mean? Well, it means stay in the aerobic zone and don't go into the lactate zone. So easy efforts. Second thing, which is more of a practical thing, make sure you bring food with you. because you may at some point burn through all of your available glucose, and that's no fun. So if you get hungry and you're on a fasted ride, eat something. Finally, the third one, large shifts in fat burning ability can be achieved by changing the diet and the fueling approach. Your base diet and how you eat before, during, and after the exercise. You can push your fat burning ability to one side, or you can push your fat burning ability to the other side. And how you choose to do that is kind of your choice. Now, I should say that if you are looking for performance, you probably don't want to push to one side or the other uniquely. You probably want some training that is designed to really improve your beta oxidation, so fasted training that really pushes that. And you want additional training that really pushes your glycolytic, your glucose burning side, because that's what you're going to need to get that power beyond the base. And there's some organized approaches, some training approaches that cycle through different diets and do different things to try to get that. If you're interested, you can find those. So that's all I wanted to talk about. Thank you for your time.